So actually, it is required rather, and you write a PhD thesis, you have to come up with some theoretical achievements. You can't just describe a case. So I think that's, and there are, I don't know whether there's a lack of such case studies. There are a lot of case studies actually. Maybe not at undergraduate level.
I mean, can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Because you talk about procedures. I think what interests me in the business of teaching translation is not so much procedures as process, as method, the underlying mental process, and in fact one of the books that you worked on, one of my favorite of all your books, right, is that book of Zen, the 100 Zen, whatever, cases, right? Because in Zen Buddhism they talk about cases, right? Because every act of enlightenment is a case study, It's like an MBA in Zen enlightenment, right? Case studies, right? Suddenly I was enlightened, And for me,
Using examples.
Yeah, for me that's what I'd love to see is a book of, 100 cases of enlightenment in the process of translation, where you have these case studies that show how suddenly somebody saw the light, whether it was, I don't care what they're translating or which language they're translating from. It seems to me that's a valuable way of studying, rather because it's people actually attaining enlightenment, And I think that students would learn infinitely more from those stories, I just want a simple book, like, in my grandparents' days they had simple stories from the Bible, how to lead a good life, so-and-so was led into temptation and then, she conquered temptation by doing this, and she became good, right? And so everything was good. Now, to me, those stories are a much better way of teaching. Brian, you want to say something about translation history and its
completely
use?
different. Now, why are there so few case studies? I'm worried about the future. In the past, before we had computers, first drafts were written out by hand and then typed. Computers leave no trace. We simply delete. What's going to happen? Where are the first drafts going to come from? Where are the materials going to come from where future students can look at our work and have something to talk about? Why to watch the process of revision changing, to watch the text growing under the translator's hands? I've actually, particularly with poetry in recent years, I've gone back to doing it, to using a notebook, so there is at least some track should anybody ever want to look at my work, which I doubt.
But I save my drafts, so always put a date on it. It's on the computer, but probably they're useless anyway, so nobody wants to look at them. But I think for me, again, translation studies now, I think even when they're studying history, they tend to shy away from the so-called empirical studies. I think that's probably, maybe that's what you're talking about, John, the case studies, and that's why you sort of feel that there's few case studies. But for me personally, I think always go back to sort of famous translators in history to sort of seek inspiration or you call it guidance or whatever. Because when I first started to translate, I tended to be a very close translator, very kind of rigid kind of translator. So, and I gradually learned to be more flexible, to be freer, so that if I'm going to so state my development as a translator, I would say sort of a change from a very kind of hard translator to a loose translator and more flexible. So I think, and then when I did that change, I always sort of I look back into history and say, well, look, the periods in history you know, things like this happen. I mean, you know, some very close translations in certain period, or, you know, by practiced by certain translator, and then later on they sort of had changed into a more flexible style. So I think, you know, for that personally, you know, just looking at the problem from a very personal point of view, I think translation history helps.
I was just going to say, I think what Brian said is one of the key issues, and that is that there often is not that paper trail. Even in the past, I look at my own work, I would produce a translation, the book eventually comes out, and my 4 or 5 drafts all go into the trash bin. I don't need them anymore. There are people who are trying to do things about that. Peter Bush at the British Center for Literary Translation has established an archive for translator drafts. Indiana University has one now, and this is to facilitate the sort of research into the process of translation, looking at how a translation evolves, looking at you know, the steps a translator has gone through to arrive at that sort of final version. And it seems like it's a growing area of interest. But archives, lack of archives seems to be the problem.
There was a wonderful series that started coming out, I think in the 80s, called The Writer at Work. And there was one volume on Thackeray, there was one on Dickens, and so on. And what you know, that was very much in reaction to a lot of current literary theory. It was looking at drafts. The one on Thackeray looked at the drafts of Vanity Fair. And I think I learned more from reading that book. I learned more about literature than from anything else I ever read. The book on Thackeray in the series The Writer at Work. And I think it would be a wonderful thing to have a series called The Translator at Work. You know, if one could find the materials to look at how, you know, in our field, people like Arthur Whaley, Ouhk, how they worked. And there's no better insight into how they work than a study of their drafts, their corrections, their revisions. Sometimes when a thing comes out in a second edition and so on, it's another tradition. It's another way of looking at the process, which is, I think, very enlightening. I suppose that's what I meant here by case studies. You know, I think there is a huge area here where people could do work. Yeah. I think what's important, to go back to my opening remarks, is that we retain our camaraderie, dare I say that? We're comrades, you know, we share this common kind of cause. There's something underlying everything that we do that brings us together. And I think that's what makes it all so interesting and so valuable. And I really think that in the end, all we try and do is to share that with our students, and hopefully, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, we succeed. And I thank many of them for coming this evening, and hope that this will lead to further discussions in the future, and that, as I'm sure is the case, I'm sure that Hong Kong will continue to be one of the focal places in the world for the teaching of translation. So thank you all very much for coming.